On a July gutter-threaded noon when the city breathed heat like a sleeping dog, someone hurled a life, thin, fur against sun, onto the black seam of the road. The cat landed with a small, surprised hiss, a sound like a coin slipping from a child's palm. Men laughed. A rubber helmet fur. The asphalt steamed as if offended. But before cruelty could settle into habit, a man with a collar as abrupt as a thunderclap stopped the laughter. He stood in the sunlight where light stuck to his coat and wore his silence like a knife. People called him a gangster, because he kept his favors in fistfuls and his mercy in single, dangerous acts. The cat curled, then uncurled, and in that precise feathered movement a world shifted. Pity entered a pocket, long thought empty. Eyes that had learned to look away looked, and a small, simple choice split the day, to leave cruelty as a custom, or to make kindness the new law. This is the moment the story listens to. This is the moment that will not be quieted. Light remembered a sermon it had never given, and the street kept the secret until evening agreed softly. He was called Abbas by the meter on the door and by the grocery girl who left bread on credit. He had been called master once before taste left his tongue like a lost coin. Loss has the manners of a patient thief. It waits. It wears your doorway thin. It takes the small things first. Slippers, the rhythm of tea, the names of birds that used to come to call. Abbas lived in a flat above a shop that sold glassware, a place where broken things sat all day in the window and learned to look like graceful survivors. His wife, Miriam, had been the weather of his existence. Since she had gone in a hospital corridor with a television murmuring like a distant sea, Abbas kept his house at half light, as if the dark might feel less lonely if it were judged. Mornings came to him as obligations. The kettle, the single cup, the radio in a language that promised the world but delivered only adverts. He moved like a man learning to walk on a new country, cautious, tentative, curving his steps around the furniture as if remembering necessary rituals. The street below was a litany of vendors and engines and small economies. Shouts were currency there. Each sound meant someone owed someone else an hour of attention. Abbas listened to these sounds the way a man reads scripture, because they were the map of how the city continued without him. The cat found him before he noticed it. It did not announce itself by prowling or preening, for the small, the always small, arrives by soft tactics. The creature first watched from the ledge when Abbas opened his window at dusk to let out the tea steam. It would sit on the sill like a comma in a sentence, patient enough to change meaning. The cat learned the cadence of his loneliness, the way his hands trembled over the spoon, the sound of his breath catching on the word Miriam. It learned to time its appearances to when the kettle whispered and when the radio reached the news, and when the house remembered to be lonely. A cat is not, in stories, a creature of conversation. It is a verb. It announces itself by the motion of attention. This particular cat came where walls thinned and listened. It would press its paws to the glass and make a curious indentation in Abbas's day, a small, firm insistence that something else existed in the room. It would not leap to his lap at first. It would merely sit and watch as if taking notes. The first touch was a suggestion, a quiet rubbing of its face to the corner of his table one evening when he dropped a sliver of bread. The cat ate the bread with the ceremony of gratitude and left a damp crescent of whisker oil on the wood. And Abbas, who had not known how to be grateful to living things for months, felt a small sharp warmth in his chest. Plants were the other witnesses in Abbas's flat. A pot of basil on the balcony had been Miriam's habit. She liked the way the leaves shook sunlight into the soup. She liked the scent like a small green bell. After she died, the basil lost its authority. It drooped, then fought back in a slow, stubborn way. New leaves pushed against the old and the plant learned to be less easy to kill. A spider plant in the kitchen begged for water like a child. These plants were not mere decoration. They were ornaments of routine, small green promises that sometimes a life continues. Abbas spoke little to them, but his hands remembered to water occasionally. And when he forgot, some neighbor would water in his absence because neighborhoods have the unspoken law of tending. The ordinary world of the flat had details that made a life. A clock with one hand that kept a patient lie. A chipped cup that had survived 3 windows. A coat on the peg that used to smell of a woman's lavender. When the cat arrived, that ordinary world began to thrum with possibility. The cat did not require explanation. It required attention and warmth and a small, clean bit of patience. In the evenings, after the kettle ceased to sing, Abbas found himself waiting at the window. The cat would arrive like a small promise of second chances. It would jump on the balcony railing and look at the jasmine as if checking an old account. The jasmine had been Miriam's plant too. Though she had preferred the basil, the jasmine grew in the corner of the balcony in a clay pot that came from a market stall. It had been placed there because Miriam liked to braid beauty into small things. She had taught Abbas how to clip dead leaves with a careful thumb and index, showing him how a life can be edited kindly. Since she passed, the jasmine found itself pruned only by weather. It seemed to lean toward the window as if seeking conversation. The cat would bury its face into the jasmine at dusk and inhale, as if knowing the scent was a memory stored in leaves. This plant, the jasmine, came to mean the memory itself, a green witness that would later be a small marker when stories needed proof. Abbas thought of the cat as a philosophy at first, a pattern of soft insistence that something else in the world still moved. It had a habit of turning its head as if greeting a thought. It had a way of leaving a curl of fur on the seat of a chair that made the fabric seem less empty. The neighbors began to watch, for neighbors are always curious about small breaches in routine. The grocery girl tapped the glass and left a saucer. The old man from 2 doors down, who sold batteries and advice, called the beast a lucky streak and tapped his forehead with the tip of his index finger as if pointing at a private joke. Abbas was outwardly a man of small means and quieter sorrow. He had worked as a tailor for years, and his hands still carried the memory of thread. They were able hands. They could coax a stubborn hem into submission. They could, with a very slight pressure, translate the way a human body wanted to be covered. But since Miriam's absence, the shop downstairs did not ask for as much coaxing. Patrons liked new fashions, and Abbas liked the older ones. He liked things that remembered how to be used. Grief had the shape of a slow retreat. It took telephone numbers with it, and sometimes the smell of jasmine out of the washcloth. He moved through his day like one expecting a knock that would never come. The city kept 1,000 small cruelties in its pockets. Some were loud, like the honk of impatient drivers. Some were quiet, like the tossing of an animal into a gutter to make a joke of fate. It was on a dry market morning, when the sunlight sent needles through dust, that the ordinary world, careful, unambitious, snapped and bent. Abbas had gone down to the pantry to fetch the bread for his cup of evening tea. He was steadying the kettle with his elbow when he heard a sound from the street unlike radio or vendors or engines. It was a keening, a brief metal note that did not belong anywhere. People in that part of town learned to identify the city's noises. Each sound has a meaning, like different types of weather. This sound was the meaning of cruelty. The cat, which had been regular in its appearances, had not come to the window that early day. Instead, Abbas noticed a small brown figure suddenly in the doorway below, one of the boys who ran errands for the shopkeepers, then a scuffle of boots and a shout. For a moment he thought a dog had been set on someone. He stepped to the window because certain sounds, the ones that hurt, have a way of luring grief toward the light. When he looked down, he saw the crowd collect like a story told in halves. A circle of faces, the flash of a boot, a small shape on heat-warped asphalt. He could not see clearly from the height, but the things he recognized were enough. The boy's face was white where it always was white, surprised at his own courage, and the crowd laughed in a way that made the sun feel colder. The cat lay on the asphalt like a letter that needed reading. The feet of men made a punctuation of their cruelty all around it. Abbas felt the old, slow island of feeling that had been his heart tilt. He went down the stairs while the kettle in the flat continued to hum the tune of something that would not be finished. There were men there who were always there, men whose jackets had the smell of engine oil and coffee and the urgency of unfinished business. There was a man whose coat stood like a cliff in the middle of the throng, tall, dark, abrupt. People called him a gangster, not because of the labels he chose, but because the city had taught them to name figures by the noise they made. He moved differently from the rest. Where others jostled for laughter, he stopped the air. He did not speak at first, he looked. Then, as if reversing the order of the world, he stooped and picked the cat up. The animal did not make a sound. It seemed to understand that a choice had been made. Abbas had known this man from eyes that peer and forget. He had seen him in the market where he paid the grocer in a way that settled accounts without counting coins. People gave him a wide berth because he wore a quiet that felt like law. Today he was holding the cat as if it were an object heavy with meaning. The crowd parted when he moved. For a man whose life had been unpicked and reknit into something that barely fit, the sight struck a bell. One single act of mercy could resonate like a sermon. Abbas felt a small, unexpected thing rise in his throat, an anger that had no audience and a soft, hopeful ache. It was an ache that recognized the possibility of being seen. The man with the collar did something peculiar. He set the cat down at the edge of the shop doorway and, without fanfare, walked toward the canal of the street as if he had completed an errand. Abbas watched him go. The boy who had stood with the others now turned away with a shame like a stain. Someone muttered that the man had done it for a favor. Someone else said he had only been showy. Abbas had no word for it then. He only had the knowledge that something in the ordinary had been altered, and that the altered thing had been placed before his threshold like an offered hymn. The cat blinked at him once, and then again, as if measuring whether this life was to be trusted. There were scorch marks along its flanks from the asphalt, and a small band of dirt across one ear. It moved as if the motion of being alive took effort. Abbas felt a decision, an old muscle flex, to look away or to do what small hard mercies require. The house had been a repository of silence, but silence cannot keep a cat from the doorway. He felt Miriam's absence as if it were the draft at the edge of a speech. He listened for the shape of his own hands and found them ready. This was the inciting incident. A small life placed on his doorstep by a man who, by reputation, trafficked in fear and favors. It was the city's way of asking Abbas if he might, after all, be asked to be part of an answer. The cat, placed like a small testament, would demand more than a glance. Whether Abbas would bend to pick up the thread of this new pattern, or fold it away like an old shirt, would determine whether the ordinary world he knew would resume or be remade. The jasmine on the balcony leaned as if it had known. The kettle, forgotten, whistled once and went mute. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. The cat came to sleep like a small verdict. It chose the chair by Abbas's window as if laying claim to a corner of the day, and in so doing began to reorganize the hours around a new obligation. There is a strange discipline in having to lift a fragile thing from hurt. It educates a man in the cadence of care. Abbas found himself rising earlier to feel the cat's weight against his palm, learning the language of breathing that says nothing and everything. The city continued to make its arguments, horns, haggling, distant televisions, but in the room beneath jasmine-scented dusk, the argument shifted. A man who had been learning to live small found himself making big, gentle choices, to cup warm milk, to fold a blanket like a promise, to give the cat a name that sounded like a repair. He called it thread, because where there was ruin, it sometimes took only a single thread to stitch a life back into pattern. Thread answered by the slow machinery of gratitude, purrs like a tiny threshing, rubs against knees, the migration of fur across an empty sleeve that made the cloth remember the shape of company. Abbas, who had been given grief as a permanent household guest, discovered that tenderness does not unseat sorrow so much as it reshapes it. He would sit at the shop window with fabric and scissors, thread curled beside his spool, and for the first time in months his hands worked with something like pleasure. Customers remarked on the steadier lines of his stitches. The grocery girl left little bowls of soup, and the battery seller, who watched from his shed as if life were a series of small experiments, nodded approval like a priest bestowing a quiet benediction. But mercy is conspicuous in crowded places. The act of saving a small creature becomes a marker. People observe. Some approve, some distrust. Rumor is the city's second language, and Thread's presence began to speak it. A whisper here, you shouldn't meddle. A harder voice there. It is not wise to own things that bring trouble. Abbas learned that even kindness carries weight, and that kindness placed in a public space can be read as a ledger, entry, credit that must be balanced or enemy that must be settled. He felt eyes at the window, not all of them neighborly, and he recognized the look of people calculating how mercy might cost them. Rahim, the man who had stooped in the market and lifted thread from the hot asphalt, did not become a character in the story in a single scene. Men like him do not announce themselves. They arrive as weather does, as a change in pressure. He returned to the neighborhood in fits, now a shadow in a doorway, now a man with a parcel of almonds under his coat. He watched Abbas with a patience that was not pity. Once he paused by the shop and left a small envelope in the cracks of the door frame. 2 notes and a rusted coin, little offerings that spoke of a code no one else named. Abbas, who had lived on credit and the goodwill of strangers all his life, recognized the currency of such things and kept the envelope like a relic. The power of a man's past is not that it stays silent. It is that it hums beneath action. Rahim's reputation made the alleyways breathe differently. Men who owed him a favor crossed the street from his shadow. Men who feared him swallowed jokes. In the beginning, only the city's small voices, newsboys, the grocer, the battery seller, spoke of him by the pet names habit assigns: Gangster, Man with a Collar, a Dangerous Mercy. But soon the thin sense of danger that hums like a wasp in summer found substance. 2 weeks after threat arrived, the groove of the street shifted. It happened as most discomforts do. First a small incident, then a ripple. A child was found crying by the canal because his ball had fallen into the water. A dog was set loose to chase pigeons and tore at a stall's cloth. A small fight began, 2 men arguing over a theft that had not occurred. It was petty theater until someone in the crowd spat a name: the boy who had thrown the cat. That name, thrown like a stone, skittered into 100 mouths with teeth. Men who kept alliances like ledger entries saw an opening. The boy's father, who had tried to make small deals, found his door painted with threats. A window was broken in the night. Abbas woke to the sound of a shout that resembled fear more than language. Small cruelties beget larger ones. That is the simple mathematics of streets. Thread became an argument in a neighborhood that was always learning what to permit. People who had not laughed at cruelty before discovered new ways to mobilize it. Because cruelty is contagious for the same reason comfort is. It is easier to become accustomed to the wrong impulse than to summon the courage to change it. Abbas realized, with a sudden clarity like a thud of the heart, that his act of mercy had given others something to contest. He had placed Thread in his home, but he had also placed Thread in the middle of a ledger the city kept, and ledgers invite balancing. The complications multiplied. A local man who called himself Musa and ran a small cafe with soda bottles and a radio that played old songs began to keep a careful distance. His cafe, once a place of community, now hummed with conspiracies. The grocery girl who left bread flinched when she heard raised voices. The battery seller, who had a soft eye for small mercies, muttered that mercy attracts attention like a moth to flame. He had seen too many things burn to trust gentle light. Abbas found himself acting like a man walking a tightrope without a net, feeling the tension in every breath. Then came the first direct demand. A youth bigger than the one who had thrown Thread came to the shop when day's heat softened into the street's long sigh. He stood outside and watched with a look someone might call hunger and another entitlement. He tapped the place where Thread had slept and spoke to Abbas as if addressing a ledger. "This cat's causing trouble. Tell the man to take it back." Abbas, whose days of sharp words had been retired, felt heat leach into his bones. He opened his mouth and heard himself say the only thing he had practiced: "It stays." The youth left with a promise like a dull blade. He spat in the gutter and walked on. The rest of the street understood. Abbas had drawn the line. The story of the man and the cat became one of those small narratives neighborhoods keep like talismans. People began to wager on whether Abbas would keep Thread if they knocked harder. Some bets were made in whispers, some in the deliberate clatter of pots. Rahim, who had the weight of other people's fears in his pocket, watched. He had not come to the shop often. His life kept the rhythms of a man who traded in favors and in a silence that enforced them. Yet when trouble grew teeth, he moved like weather again, appearing when the day needed a change in temperature. Abbas tried to live by rules of gentleness, but rules are fragile when pressure rises. The cat's health, which had seemed to improve like a plant finding water, took a small worrying turn. Thread began to cough at night, a dry sound that made Abbas imagine all the small ways the world damages living things. He worried the cough was from heat, or from grief, or from asphalt, and the worry drove him to attempt small things: extra milk, a warm patch by the heater, a gentle hand across fur. When the cough persisted and Thread's eyes grew dull like old coins, he knew to ask for help, not because he was proud, but because some mercies require a public account. Veterinary care is an expensive ritual in a city that does not allot much credit to tenderness. Abbas paced the shop, fingers looping through Thread, trying to count coins that hung like prayers. He thought of the envelope Rahim had left, the coin glinting like a promise. but it was shamefully small to go ask a man for the money that would bring a creature back from the brink. Pride is a private religion. He had been a practitioner. Yet the small creature's cough made him confess. He closed the shop for the afternoon and walked to Rahim's doorway, feeling like a man who had to ask forgiveness and a favor in the same breath. Rahim opened the door as if the favor had been expected. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and coffee and the residue of decisions made long ago. He did not speak at first. He simply held out his hand for the envelope Abbas had left in the crack. Abbas, who had rehearsed embarrassment, found his tongue steady. He told Rahim about Thread's cough, about the way Mercy now required payment. Rahim's face was a map where small lines spoke of many roads. He gave Abbas a small nod, and then he gave him more than the money. He offered an arrangement. It was not charity in the ordinary sense. Rahim offered to pay for the vet if Abbas would keep the cat where it was for the time being, and not talk to people about it. He explained in the tone of a man naming consequences that some things, once noticed, must be contained. People look, Rahim said. Some of those looking have hands in other matters. Abbas nodded, feeling the weight of the words like rain in summer. To accept Rahim's money was to enter into an economy that had its own laws. But it would save the animal. That was the metric Abbas could return to without a ledger, goodness measured in the immediate saving of a life. The vet's office was a small, bright place, smelling faintly of antiseptic and old newspapers. The vet, a woman with steady hands and an impatience with stories that pretended to be moral, examined Thread with professional kindness. She found a cut, an old abrasion on the flank and worry in the lungs. Then with a scanner the shape of a small wand, she checked for a chip. The machine beeped, a faint electric note like a moth complaining at a window. There was a chip. Abbas and Rahim listened as the vet read the registration, an address, a name. Naila, the vet said, and the word hung like a stone. Rahim, who had been looking at Thread with a guarded kindness, moved as if the air had sharpened. The name Naila was not a neutral syllable in his mouth. He paled slightly as if memory were a wound and then steadied. Naila had been a name he had not permitted himself to say aloud for many years. A woman who had been the hinge of an old life and the origin of a betray that had split his world. Her name was a place where choices had been made and wrong turns taken, and it carried with it the memory of an incident that had outlawed any gentle impulses he had once practiced openly. Abbas watched Rahim like a man watching weather turn into storm. This was the first secret the city had hidden in Thread's fur. The cat, it seemed, had belonged once to a woman whose life intersected with Rahim's in ways that would complicate everything. The vet gave Abbas a folded piece of paper with the registration details and an address printed fine as a whisper. Abbas read the address aloud in a voice that was small and thorough. Rahim's reaction was immediate and irreversible. He took the paper from Abbas's hand as if a transfer like that dispensed with formalities. He breathed the address to himself as if tasting a map. The complications multiplied like shadows in evening. The presence of a microchip with a name from Rahim's past meant the cat was not merely a stray, but a marker on a path that had been walked before. It indicated an origin and a possible owner, and with an owner came questions. Where was she? Was she safe? Had she been the target of the cruelty that had led a small beast to be thrown on hot asphalt in the first place? Rahim, who had been an actor in his own life's theater, now found his past made public by a small blinking machine. He could not unknow the name. Abbas, who had thought himself a man whose life was altered by kindness, realized that kindness could make one a party in other people's histories. Do you know her? Abbas asked. Because one must name things in order to understand how they might wound. Rahim's silence was a stone. He met Abbas's eyes and said finally, She was close, long ago. He folded his hands as if folding a map one last time. If she is alive, he said, then this is not only a cat. This is a messenger. The word struck a bell. In streets, messengers are seldom benign. Messages bring news, favors, demands. The neighborhood, which had been in a soft state of argument over Mercy, smelled suddenly of something harder. Unfinished accounts. Rahim's face, which had been a study in weathered indifference, betrayed a crack of old tenderness and new fear. He told Abbas in small, clipped sentences that Naila's name had been spoken in an old quarrel. She had been important enough that past debts were measured in the currency of reputation and sometimes in blood. Abbas felt his stomach knot. The decision he had made, to keep Thread, had now placed him on a road he had not chosen. At this moment the story reached a decisive noir of sorts. Abbas could walk away, hand Thread over to Rahim's care, let the past swallow the incident like a tide, or he could stand on the little doorstep and refuse to be moved. Rahim did not ask Abbas to choose. He gave him the option by implication. "Accompany me," he said with his eyes, "or do not." Either way, knowledge had been transferred. The turning point, the narrative's point of no return, arrived as a quiet instruction. To possess knowledge about someone else's buried life is to become a participant in its consequences. Midway through this rising tide of obligations and revelations, Abbas found himself asking a question that was not rhetorical but urgent. Had he ever really been alone? Thread's small body, heavy now from warmth, had made him answer that he had not. The act of keeping a life asks for reciprocity. He felt a new kind of responsibility grow like moss on stone, stubborn, inevitable. And when Rahim suggested they travel to the address on the registration in the early morning, before the street's temperature gathered witnesses, Abbas felt both fear and a peculiar relief. There was relief in walking toward a thing rather than away from it. It was better, he thought, to step into the rain if the rain promised green. Here at the midway point, the story pauses like a hand in a poem and asks its quieter reader to reflect. Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Do you believe cats know when we're at our lowest? Abbas had not had a choice about Thread's arrival. Neither had Thread. The question was whether presence, once given, demands a change in the ledger. Abbas felt that it did. They planned with the sort of careful silence that people use when they do things they do not want known. Rahim said little in the night before the journey. He stood on the balcony and smelled jasmine as if testing whether memory still carried scent. The jasmine, which had witnessed grief and quiet, bent as if answering. Thread slept between the basil and the jasmine that night, and seemed to pulse with the rhythm of two lives. Rahim, whose world had been built of stone rules and the occasional mercy, looked at Abbas with a softness he had not permitted himself before. "If she's there," he said, "we will find out what the past left. If not, we will carry forward with the living. But we will not let this—" He gestured, as if encompassing the street and all its unasked cruelties, "continue as it has been." There came new, harder pressures after that quiet pact. Men who traffic in fear noticed movement among allies and suspected weakness. A note appeared on Abbas's door, ink on paper sharpened, saying only, "Keep out of it." It felt like advice and a threat in the same breath. Hose pipes were cut in the night, and one cold morning Thread's food bowl was stolen. The city's small cruelties became personalized. The battery seller offered Abbas spare coins and a look of apology. Musa locked his cafe in the evening for the first time in months and watched the street with the look of a man, peering into a cooking pot hoping to find tomorrow's meal. The pressure built as if stitched from small frictions. Abbas and Rahim met at dawn and started toward the address. The walk was not long, but it was dense. Rahim kept his head down, and Abbas carried Thread in a blanket like a parcel of fragile law. The street smelled of bread and distant laundry. Pigeons gathered like punctuation. They passed the canal where the child had lost his ball. They passed the place where someone had once painted a window in angry blue. Each landmark had a memory attached, and memory made the walk righteous and dangerous at once. When they arrived at the address printed on the chip's registration, it was clear that Nayla's was a life that had been erased in pieces. The house was small, its paint gone like old teeth. A woman in the doorway looked up at them, and for a second time Rahim's face changed in a map anyone could read. The woman's eyes held a history like a ledger. She looked at Thread and then at Rahim, and somehow the look passed between them as if a debt was being calculated. She did not step forward at once. She let Thread blink at her, let the cat smell spin a circle between the three of them. Then she took in Rahim as if he were a long broken instrument and decided whether to play him. The revelation that followed was not neat. Nayla had been small in the city's record, small but persistent, a nurse who tended to people whom official records had marked as unprofitable. She had done small mercies quietly. Rahim had once known her before his life had hardened into the collar he now wore. Something in that past had gone wrong, an argument, a betrayal, a left turn that had cost more than money. Nayla had disappeared from the kind of life that leaves paper trails. She had been rumored to be gone, but in truth she had been there, living with a smallness that preserved dignity. Thread, it turned out, had been her companion and her courier, meant to carry small messages between friends when the world became hostile. The layers of the past made the present difficult. Nayla told a story that did not yield to a single moral. She spoke of a time when Rahim had been less guarded, of a time when mercy and fury had balanced each other precariously. She told them, in a voice like a bell under snow, that Thread had been given to her by a neighbor who knew how dangerous the city could be for small things. The cat had been stolen or misplaced in the shuffle of things, then thrown out like an accusation. Her life, she said, had taught her not to trust the loud men who judged silence as weakness. Rahim listened and then confessed small faults, his voice admitting to what a ledger of conscience records. He had failed to protect. He had chosen certain roads because they were shorter, and the world's demands were heavier than his courage. The confession, when it came, was not dramatic. It was the slow unbuttoning of a man who had been wearing his armor for so long that removal felt like exposure. Abbas heard the admission and felt the street press its ear to the conversation. There was a sense that a knot was being untied. Yet untying a knot releases something else, loose threads. That afternoon, when they returned with Thread and with a brittle sort of reconciliation, there were more signs that the street was not content with small restorations. The boy who had thrown Thread reappeared, this time with two men whose smiles were too bright for kindness. They stood in the sunlight and made loud jokes about mercy. Rahim, who had been patient, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that had a low authority. Words were exchanged that sounded like old accounts being resumed. There was the flash of a temper, a shove, a hand that landed wrong. The men laughed, then slunk away as if they had decided to postpone mischief. The street exhaled, but the exhale had grit in it. The turning point came not in the confession alone, but in the consequences that followed. Rahim, having let the past be named, realized the past had teeth. Why it did so was a web of debts and angry men who keep scores for their own reasons. Men who had lost something to the old arrangement, their standing, their expected fear, began to test whether Rahim's softness would extend to others who showed him favor. Abbas understood with the same clarity he had felt when Thread first breathed against his palm, that once you step into another person's history, you cannot step out without carrying their burdens. It was an irreversible choice. To protect a life is also to accept the entanglements that life brings. By the time night leaned into the alleys, the neighborhood had become a field of looks and locked doors. Abbas closed his shutter as if closing the lid on a small territory, and felt the now familiar claustrophobia of being watched meld with the new sensation of being targeted. The next morning, the door to his shop was smeared with a message done in splatter and intention, a warning ugly and unambiguous. A small item had been left on his doorstep as well, a shoe small and muddy and a scrap of paper with a single word: leave. The handwriting was not crude. It was professional in its threat. Abbas felt fear as a new currency. He had to convert his courage into something actionable. He sat with Thread on his lap, feeling the creature's pulse like a soft metronome. The city outside hummed with the same continuity it always had, but in his house the air tasted like copper. Rahim came by that evening without the envelope or the coin this time. He came with a proposition that required both courage and a readiness to accept risk. He offered to station a watcher near Abbas's shop for a while, men who would keep an eye with the careful indifference of those who act in the night. The offer smelled like armor. Abbas accepted it the way a man accepts a bandage. They made preparations, small and significant. Abbas sewed a tighter seam in the cat's blanket. Rahim ensured that men who kept the peace would do so with more discretion than boast. Thread, confused by the sudden formalities, crawled into the crook of Abbas's arm and slept. That same night, when the street had gone soft with the city's own dreams, someone tried a new tactic. A window was smashed on the first floor across the street. A bottle flew through the air. Dogs began to bark in panic. Abbas woke to the sound and looked at Thread with a clarity that made his throat ache. He dressed, moving in the quiet ritual of a man who understands small urgencies. Rahim arrived at the door not with men, but with a face pale and set. "Things are changing," Rahim said. "They do not like it when we keep the things that rightfully provoke them." Before Abbas could answer, a car drove fast down the street with headlights like accusation. Men in the car shouted and flung curses that were heavier than words. A shot rang out somewhere down the alley in a sound like a dropped pot. People moved in their sleep and the city's seams began to show strain. Abbas felt the energy of danger wrap itself like a cold band around his chest. The cliffhanger arrived not as an explanation, but as a rupture. In the noise and the scramble of those moments, thread vanished. In 1 second the cat was in Abbas's arms. In the next it was gone. No footprints, no fur, no sign except a smear on the pavement that might have been blood, or might have been the color of a life interrupted. Rahim swore in a voice that was not usually given to oaths. Abbas felt the ground shift and then crack. Men gathered at the doorway, faces like questions. A figure from the car had run to the shop and stood there in the neon and dust, looking at Abbas as if measuring a sentence. "Where's the cat?" he demanded. His voice made everyone in the street fall into a sudden, calculated silence. He did not ask as one asked for directions. He demanded as one claims the property of the world. Abbas opened his mouth to say something true and necessary, but before he could, the man in the car lifted his hand and showed something folded and dark that glinted. A small scrap of paper with Rahim's name on it, and a single, imminent instruction: leave now or face consequences that do not apologize. In that instant, the neighborhood felt reshaped. Threats had turned into demands. Mercy had become a crime in the calculus of some men. Thread's disappearance was not a mere theft. It was a declaration. The knowledge that Nayla's name had been on the chip now seemed less like a clue than a provocation. Abbas stood with the taste of jasmine in his nose and the hot curve of fear in his throat, and Rahim's hand, when it found his shoulder, was steady but heavy like the knowledge of a man who knows debts will be called. The rising action had reached its peak of pressure. Acquaintances had become threats. The past had bled into the present, and a small animal had become the linchpin for decisions that would not be undone easily. The city exhaled its usual noises, but under that breath a new current ran. Men were moving accounts. Favors were being tallied, and somewhere in the dark a plan began that would test the fragile mercies Abbas had summoned. The cliffhanger held the street like a held breath. Thread was missing. A name from Rahim's past had been revealed, and an ultimatum had been issued. Outside, a dog howled as if summoning an answer. Inside, the jasmine's leaves trembled, and Abbas realized that the life he had tried to mend was now a fulcrum on which other lives would pivot. Night fell like a verdict, sharp and final. Flames from a distant cart licked the air with orange impatience. Dogs answered in a chorus that sounded like old promises breaking. Abbas stood in his doorway holding a blanket that carried the cat's rhythm, feeling the street lay its ledger before him. Rahim arrived with a coat that had the smell of rain and tobacco, his hands steady as a man who balances small accounts. Somewhere a car idled with its light like a watchful eye. A whistle cut through the closeness, 3 notes that meant trouble. Then silence like a hand over a mouth. Thread had gone missing, and the absent spoke in tight syllables. The neighborhood gathered like reluctant witnesses. Shutters clicked into place like lids, and the jasmine on Abbas's balcony sagged as if tired of smelling the city's sharpness. Abbas felt the old habit of retreat and the newer habit of courage evenly matched in his chest. He thought of Miriam's voice, soft, instructive, telling him once to hold fast to what made life softer. In 2 breaths he chose to step beyond his threshold. The street did not wait. He felt destiny sharpen into a single necessary step that night. The night was a thin thing, stretched tight over the city, and every sound made it quiver. Abbas moved with a deliberate slowness so that he might not frighten the edges of it. Rahim walked beside him like a veteran of weather, one shoulder slightly higher as if bracing against some invisible wind. They carried Thread's blanket between them, for the cat's smell was now a map of many decisions. Milk and jasmine and the faint, useless tang of asphalt. The men whom Rahim had trusted to watch the shop sat across the way beneath a shutter, faces like low coin. They had eyes that read the street in short phrases and hands that understood how to close a night down if necessary. Their plan was as modest as the courage that spurred it. Rahim had learned, by degrees and by debts, that the men who had taken Thread did not act alone. They took advantage of an economy built on fear. They had a place where they kept things, an iron corrugated courtyard near the river where old motors and older grudges stacked their ribs under tarpaulin. For those who read neighborhoods like books, the place smelled of burnt oil and promises that had stopped being kept. Rahim had the roots of that place etching at the edges of his lips. He had a key that fit a gate, and men who would open it because they owed him favors measured in small mercies. Abbas felt his breath as a thing separate from his courage. He recalled Miriam's hands, the careful way she would fold a scarf, the patient authority of someone who knew how to repair. In such memories, courage finds its name. He had not been born to loud heroics. His heroism was of the sort that answers a soft, insistent call. He had been a man who could coax him into honest shapes. He was now a man who would, if necessary, coax a life back from the mouths of others. They moved through alleys that smelled of cumin and old rain. A stray dog crossed their path with a slow, certain step, no longer a threat than the moon. The city's soundscape tightened. A radio somewhere playing a song that had run out of sentiment, the soft rattle of a cartwheel that remembered rhythm. Rahim led with the aim of someone carrying a debt and a hope at once. He spoke little because words are currency that spends itself quickly when night is at stake. Abbas listened to the rhythm of Rahim's feet and realized that this man, whose reputation had been shaped by the hardness of other people's fear, was now walking under the lightness of an obligation he had chosen to carry. When they reached the corrugated courtyard, a low metallic smell stepped forward to meet them. Men lounged on the edges of rusted engines as if they were stationary animals. A single bulb hung from a wire like an eye gone lazy with boredom. Rahim touched the bulb as if testing whether it would blink awake. The gate swung open with a creak that sounded like a throat clearing. Inside the yard the air was hotter, as if the earth kept the memory of flame. There were figures moving with the stalker's economy of people who owe debts and collect them. Abbas's mouth was dry. He thought of Thread's small purr and the way it had pressed into his palm as if to say, "We are not finished yet." Thread, though small, had become the city's interrogator. It forced answers from men who would rather the page remain unread. They did not yet see the men who had taken the cat. Those men were behind a stack of tires, voices low and careful. The leader, a stocky youth with a sharp jaw and a habit of laughing at wrong moments, bragged about the power of making others anxious. He had his own small crowd, men who took pleasure in the calculation of cruelty. They had made a bargain with fear and found the terms favorable. When the stocky youth noticed the two strangers, his smile sharpened into something that looked like teeth with a purpose. Rahim did not waste the night with speech. He let Abbas sit a moment on the lip of a discarded engine to breathe. Abbas could feel the city's muscles taut like a bow. Then Rahim moved, and those around him reacted the way weather changes when a cloud decides to rain. A man at the edge of the yard, a man whose face-time had hardened like leather but whose hands were quick with the particularity of favor, stood and said, in a voice measured for violence, "We have guests." That phrase was enough to pull eyes and weapons from sleep. The exchange that followed was not the one Abbas had expected. No immediate fight, no thunder of bodies. It was instead a negotiation held within the language of a city that measures men by the quality of their bargains. Rahim's posture was both an apology and a command. He stepped forward and spoke to the stocky youth in the quiet cadences of a man who has made and received much. "We want the cat returned," he said. The youth laughed, a sudden brittle sound, and then asked for terms as if they were haggling for a pomegranate. The haggling revealed the heart of the matter. For these men, the cat had become more than fur and whisker. It had become proof that they could act without consequence. "We'll give it back for coin," the youth said, "or for a favor." The words were a kind of edge, and Abbas realized that favors in that courtyard were not the same tidy things Rahim had once advanced in daylight. They were the kind that asked for silence or complicity. Rahim, whose life had learned the price of silences, tensed. Abbas saw the moment arriving. Would Rahim pay in his old currency, in his old tenured favors, or would he fight with the new currency of compassion? Abbas wished to claim a moral high. In truth, his heart beat like a trapped bird. Rahim, listening, showed something like a crack of old regret. His face, usually a map of careful absolutes, loosened. He looked at Abbas and then at the youth. "No favors," he said. "No debts. Nothing that will come due later." His voice was the sort that can close an argument without seeming to have closed it. "Return the cat, or you will return it under terms you won't like." The threat hung as a taut thread. The stocky youth tossed his head and called out, "You think your men scare me?" At that, a figure stepped from the shadow, a man with the look of someone who had been shaped by smaller and subtler cruelties than the stocky youth. He carried thread slung in a sack like a stolen thing. Thread, hearing the clamor, chirped and leaped in the sack with a small angry noise. Abbas's heart leapt as if the cat's sound were the first stroke of a bell. He reached out, but his hand found only cold metal and dust. Rahim moved quickly then, not with the temper of fists, but with the authority of someone who had the touchstones of the street sewn into his cuffs. He advanced on the man who held the sack and took it from his hands. For a breath, nothing happened. Then a scuffle erupted, not broad but sharp, like recalling a wound. A man lunged for Rahim's throat. Another tried to close off the gate. Abbas, who had never been made for this, felt the animality of his own fear transform into a practical clarity. He grabbed a loose rod and held it like a tool, like the instrument of a tailor-turned soldier for the night. The fight that followed was small and terrible. Rahim fought with the economy of someone who had spent much of his life ensuring that his punch counted. He struck with a control that was not brutality but precision. The stocky youth found his grand gestures answered by a steadier hand. Men who had thought of cruelty as sport discovered that the cost of sport can be heavy. Abbas, acting on some new stubbornness-born courage, pinned a man to the ground with the same methodical insistence he had once used to mend seams. The men cried out in the small language of shock and disgrace. It was not a glorious battle. There were no grand speeches. There was simply the sound of bodies announcing the consequences of their choices. Amidst the shoving and the low curses, Thread's sack tore. The cat darted like a comet freed from a socket, fur a gray smear against the courtyard's rust. It sprang into Abbas's arms first and then slid to the earth in a pattern of small leaps. Abbas felt the cat's body against his chest as if an engine had been reattached to a broken machine. The relief was a physical thing that made his knees weak. Thread looked up at him with a face that had seen injustice and did not yet forgive, and then it rubbed its head against Abbas's hand as if sealing a treaty. But the world did not grant a clean triumph. A shout rose from the gate, a shout that meant the arrival of backup, and within a heartbeat a different car's headlights cut through the courtyards dim like knives. Men who had been on the periphery of the fight slid behind the engines. The stocky youth had not been the only one with allies. The gate lurched as if something heavy pressed against it from the outside, and Rahim's face, which had been a sheet of resolve, tightened into an expression that read, of ledger and law. He looked at Abbas, and for a second the two men exchanged a loneliness that was older than either of them. It was Rahim who made the decisive choice. He set Thread into Abbas's arms and stepped toward the gate as if to meet whatever force gathered there. The light through the gate was a savage white. Voices outside were many but taut. Orders were given that were not questions. Rahim's shoulders squared. "Go," he hissed at Abbas. "Take the cat home. Go now." He said it not as order, but as a passing of a trust that carries its own peril. Abbas wanted to stay, wanted to fight, wanted to join whatever storm came to protect what they had saved. But the pressure of Rahim's look made his defiance shrink into obedience. He turned and ran. Thread held like a fragile argument against the world. As Abbas ran through the alleyways that had been his map for years, the city around him seemed newly disloyal. He felt a peculiar inversion. The man who had been a hermit to his grief now bore a living testament to courage. Rahim's silhouette receded and then was swallowed by the white light and the crowd's deepening roar. Abbas heard a sound that had nothing to do with reason, a single shot that filled the night like the sudden strike of a large clock. He stopped and clutched the blanket, feeling the cat's heart hammer its small, furious rhythm. The alley smelled of smoke and wet metal. He wanted to turn back. He wanted to run headlong into whatever the city offered and pull Rahim from harm. Thread crouched in his arms as if curating a new language of patience. Purr, breathe, persist. The choice that Abbas made then would define him. He could remain in the safety of distance, plant himself behind the jasmine and the basil and the small plants that had once been symbols of quiet repair. Or he could return and accept the moral cost of interfering in a life that had once been given over to another order. Abbas, who had learned to listen to the small urgencies of kindness, made a decision in the duration of 2 heartbeats. He turned and moved back toward the light. The courtyard was chaos when he returned. Men lay where they had been thrown. A few stumbled, then got up with the stubbornness of those who have practiced bravado enough to keep making the same mistakes. Rahim was on his feet, but not alone. He was surrounded by men who had once been his rivals, and now testified to a loyalty that did not ask pardon. The stocky youth lay on the ground with a lip split like a tear in cloth. His allies milled with uncertainty. The car that had brought the men reshaped itself like a retreating wave. A figure in the crowd had vanished into a side alley. There were shouts and the smell of iron and the scuff of many small shoes scrabbling for meaning. Then Rahim saw Abbas and Thread together, and something in him loosened. It was as though the sight of the cat in Abbas's arms absolved him of an old private debt. He moved toward them, his face a map of something like relief edged with pain. A man at Rahim's elbow bore a small smile that belonged to an old proverb, that mercy fetched its own allies. Rahim did not boast nor did he seek applause. He simply folded Thread into the crook of his arm and offered the cat to Abbas with both hands. "Keep it," he said. "Take it back. Some things belong to the living." There was a simplicity to the phrase that made Abub's chest unclench. The courtyard's noise began to settle like dust after a wind. Men muttered and collected themselves and slowly decided to return to their own rhythms. The stocky youth, his pride in tatters, spat a last word and walked away with the reluctance of one who loses a small war, but keeps a dangerous imagination intact. At that instant, a new element entered the scene that Abbas could not have predicted. From among the crowd moved a woman with the worn hands of someone who knows how to heal small things. She was small, and she walked like someone who has learned to step in between sorrow and action. Her hair had spent itself on gray, and there was a gentleness in her step that made the air around her feel less sharp. Abbas's breath stopped because this woman wore a face that matched the name he had once heard on a vet's paper, Naila. She did not approach with accusation first. She approached as one who gathers facts with the patience of a nurse. Her eyes skimmed Rahim's face, Abbas's face, the stocky youth's bruised mouth, and then she looked at Thread, alive, blinking, unbowed. The cat looked up at her with a small recognition, as if the air between them contained the residue of a domestic map. Naila's gaze met Rahim's and found an old ledger unread. For a moment the scene halted like a page used before. Naila's voice was less a question than a tuning. "Was it you?" she asked Rahim, not for a confession but to measure whether the man before her had the courage to own his past. Rahim, who had confronted his ghosts by choosing to protect rather than punish, met her eyes and nodded. His nod was not an apology wrapped in performance. It was an admission like someone returning a borrowed thing. A hush fell so deep the bulb in the courtyard seemed to listen. Abbas felt the city's gaze like rainfall. Naila took a step toward Rahim with Thread in his arms. She touched the cat as if checking for warmth and then, without rage or triumph, she reached out and touched Rahim's hand. The simple contact resonated like a bell struck at the heart of old debts. Rahim's face broke in such a way that Abbas realized traits of weather and human contrition, rain and clearing, had come to stand before him. "Why?" Naila asked, not of Rahim this time, but of the world that had allowed small cruelties to be staged for sport. Rahim could not answer with words alone. He could point only to the small stretch of night's events. Men gathered, a cat stolen, a life risked, and a choice to stand. He had chosen to stand. Naila's eyes shone with something like tired approval. She looked at Abbas and then back at the man who had been her old life and perhaps her old wound. "It was a test," Rahim said quietly, "of the town, of me." His tone was not defensive. It was a recounting of a personal arithmetic. Abbas felt for a moment that the city around them had been given a paragraph it had not earned. A story where courage and contrition met and did not cancel each other out. The climax was not yet complete. As men began to gather themselves and the courtyard resumed its quieter noises, a figure slipped from behind a rusted oil drum and into the gate. He moved with the deliberation of one who has rehearsed escape. In his hand he held a folded cloth that had something dark inside it. The silence that greeted him was not friendly. He smiled as if the world had sanctioned his right to mischief and lifted the cloth. What fell from it was not thread, but a small, filthy note with a message that smelled of old men's threats. "You did not pay what was owed. There will be reckoning." The arrival of that scrap made everyone remember the ledger of the city. Rahim's shoulders set again. He stepped forward, and Abbas understood then that the decision had consequences beyond the night and beyond thread. The men who watched began to edge back into the small scripts of their lives, some choosing to keep watch together for a while longer, others deciding that this was as much danger as they would take. Rahim looked at Abbas and then at Naila. There was no swagger left in him, only a resolution formed from the bones of old error. The true decisive moment arrived not as a single blast, but as a composed act. Rahim called forth those men who owed him favors and collected them with the quiet gravity of a man, assembling a mantle for protection. He announced that they would not be cowed into making reckoning into a language for others. They would, if necessary, bring the matter before the informal council that ran the margins of such neighborhoods. The men who kept order without papers, the women who had survived by their own slow economies. Rahim chose to bring the city into a form of accountable justice. It was a gamble because the city thrives on unobserved cruelties. It is the place where the quiet is often the most dangerous. Abbas, who had once been content with the small justice of sewing hymns and handing out tea, felt a surge of something he had not expected, a fierce protectorship. He stood beside Rahim and Nayla, who together formed a kind of unofficial trinity, past, present, and the small living hinge that Thread had become. The choice that Rahim made displayed a quality that could not be judged only as heroic or cowardly. It was moral in that old sense, deciding what one will and will not allow in the world one shares with others. As the courtyard filled with the slow geometry of a vigil, lanterns lit, men making small pacts with their eyes over the matter, someone on the edge of the street gave a shout and pointed toward the river. In that instant the air changed shape. From the direction of the bridge came a shape that belonged to the men who had once kept their own accounts by different laws. They were moving in numbers. The possibility of a larger conflict pressed on the night like a storm front. Rahim's group, gathered quickly into a fragile order, did the only thing it could. It prepared. Abbas watched the preparations with the felt sense of a man who had been spun into the machinery of consequence. He could see that this night would become a hinge on which the neighborhood might tilt toward a kind of ordered courage, or toward the creeping acceptance of cruelty as custom. He remembered Mariam's quiet insistence that a life should be tended, and he decided then that he would not be the one to let neglect become doctrine. The last movement of the night was the least predictable. As bodies gathered and plans sketched themselves in anxious gestures, Thread leapt from Abbas's arms and disappeared into the throng, as if the cat itself were a small oracle who wanted no audience. It darted between legs and under a truck and then paused at the feet of the stocky youth who had initiated the theft. The youth froze as if seeing his own smallness reflected. Thread walked up to him, head high, and brushed its flank against the youth's shins. The act was a simple quotidian revolution, a living thing reminding a man that he is still capable of gentleness. For a second the youth seemed flummoxed. The edges of his hardness softened. Yet outside, beyond the courtyard, men had begun to take positions. An uglier plan creased into being. A shout rose that was not one of counsel but of command. The youth looked up as if hearing a voice older than mercy. He nodded briefly, and then in a movement that surprised Abbas, he stepped back and looked toward the gathering beyond the gate. The choice he made in that gap, whether he would stand with the cruel men who had financed their courage with the theft of small things, or whether he would, for once, step into a different future, would decide not only the night's outcome but the moral atmosphere of the street for weeks to come. It was in that breath, as the gate trembled with the pressure of men coming close and Thread's small body warmed against the youth's leg, that Abbas felt the world hang by a single trembling filament. He had made choices of late: tenderness, trust, small mercies, and now all these small acts assembled into an accusation and a defense. Rahim looked at the youth and then across the courtyard at the gathering beyond the gate. He had a look that belonged to a man at the center of his story's turning point, either to escalate into violence or to call the town's informal laws into action and insist on a different currency. Before any definitive resolution could be declared, before the men beyond the gate positioned themselves like weather that will decide a season, a single figure emerged from the crowd at the river's edge and raised a hand. He was not one of Rahim's men. He was older, with the steady patience of someone who had learned the worth of words over weapons. He called out, his voice carrying with the authority of someone who has kept lists and knows how to settle them. He offered the youth a choice that had been made by elders for centuries in such neighborhoods: to bring the matter to the council, to name grievances and to accept terms publicly, or to let the night become something uglier. The yard fell silent in a way that felt as if the city itself were held in the balance. Men listened as if to an old law return. The stocky youth swallowed. His friends looked between him and the gate in the face of the man with the steady voice. The options hovered like birds before a storm. Then, with the indecision of novices, the youth nodded toward the council proposition. Rahim exhaled. The men beyond the gate retreated slowly, having been denied the immediate spectacle of making justice into their own instrument of pleasure. The courtyard's tension dissolved into something less jagged, a wary acceptance that the night would not yield the cheap thrill of cruelty without an accounting. Abbas, who had done nothing exemplary save choose to hold a small life, felt the city breathe again, but differently now, like a man who has been made accountable in public for an act of kindness. And yet the climax does not end with tidy peace. In the hush that followed, Nyla bent and touched Rahim's arm. "There are debts you must still pay," she said softly, and the words were not acquittal but a summons. Rahim met them with the firmness of a man who has decided that restitution is not merely payment, but a change of habit. He would, she implied, need to address what had been done long ago. He looked at Abbas, at Thread, at the small plants that would witness the morning, the basil, the jasmine, the spider plant trembling in their pots like watchers. He nodded. There was work yet to be done. As the men dispersed under the watchful eyes of the informal council's emissaries, as the city's usual nocturnal noises tried to reassert themselves, a new uncertainty threaded the air. The notice left on Abbas's door, "Leave," remained like a bruise. The youth's partial retreat did not mean the city had changed its laws overnight. A reckoning had been postponed but not erased. Rahim had chosen a form of accountability over unchecked force. But accountability in this part of the world is a fragile thing that can be upended with one act of cowardice or one sanctioned reprisal. Abbas carried Thread back through streets that now felt, to him, both hostile and tethered by a new promise. He thought of the jasmine pruned by Mariam's hands and how it would not by itself guarantee peace. He thought of Nyla's small figure and Rahim's slow, costly decision to step into a different kind of courage. He felt, too, the weight of a city that will test any soft thing by throwing a stone at it to see what breaks. The decisive moment had come and been met. Men had been challenged. A cat had returned. A woman from the past had touched the present. And a gangster whose coat had once meant intimidation had chosen to protect rather than dominate. Yet the night did not end with triumphal music. It ended with a question that would not be answered that evening. Would mercy become the currency of the neighborhood, or the motif of a single night that would be forgotten by those who had the stomach for cruelty? Would you stay if you were in their place? When the first chill of morning stole the heat from the gutters, the city did not pretend its wounds had vanished. It wrapped them in routine like bandages. Carts clattered, women called their children, a radio somewhere played a song with no aspiration to mend anything. Yet the night that had been filled with the threat of rupture had altered the ledger of little things. Threads now ran differently through the town's fabric. Not everything was fixed. Few tragedies are so generous, but things had been shifted enough to make space for repair. Abbas returned to his shop as if re-entering a house he had helped rebuild in sleep. He carried Thread in a blanket still threaded with the night's residue, dust, the faint smell of tobacco, and the animal's steady, now calm breathing. The cat nestled in the crook of his arm like a small legal document, proof that some acts write a new clause into life. Passing through the doorway, Abbas felt the jasmine lean toward him in the morning light, its leaves whispering as if reading news. He thought, with a sudden domestic happiness that might have surprised Mariam were she there to witness it, that small plants keep an account of the days in their green memory. The basil, which had been tended by her hands and then left to sullen habit, now brightened at his approach as if recognizing a steward. The spider plant, perennial and patient, thrust a new tendril toward the sun with the kind of optimism that does not ask for much. Inside the small room, the sense of aftermath was not dramatic. It was made of details. The bowl that had held Thread's milk was still in place, rimmed with a faint crust. A thread Abbas had mended in the early hours of the morning lay curled like a sleeping thing on his work table. He set Thread's blanket gently on the chair by the window and watched as the cat described the simple domestic business of washing, a thoroughness that seemed part prayer and part criticism. Thread's healing would be slow and not linear. Lungs, once peppered with asphalt's dust, do not return to clear air overnight. But there was a new rule in the house. Whatever the day required, he would answer. Rahim visited the shop that afternoon as light thinned toward warm bronze. He came without the armor of a reputation one would read of in market talk. Instead, his manner was like a man who carries the memory of his own mistakes in his pockets and wants to empty them. He did not ask for attention. He took the chair across from Abbas as if sitting down for a meal both men had been invited to steal. For a while they spoke of small things, how the jasmine smelled, whether the basil liked shade, because such talk is a tool for people stitching trust back together. Finally, Rahim produced a little book, pocket-sized and splotched with age. Inside it were names and small accounts, the sort of ledger a man might keep for wrongs he had done and favors he owed. He set the book between them like an offering. "You kept the cat," Rahim said. "You sheltered a thing no one else would have. You tied yourself to something that will ask of you always." He did not state this as accusation. It was observation. Abbas understood immediately that the man's meaning included both gratitude and a warning. Kindness invites responsibility. Rahim closed the book and with a careful finger pointed to a single line. It listed small wrongs in the particular way he proposed to make them right, not in coin but in deeds of the neighborhood's making. Return windows fixed, doors unpainted with threats, safe paths for market women walking home in the dark. It was an accounting that would cost him both time and the surrender of certain habits. "I will start," he said, "by keeping watch in places I once used to own by fear. I will pay my part." This was not the drama of a sudden conversion. Rahim's steps toward reparations were measured and wary, the same posture a man takes when learning to walk on glass. He did not proclaim himself healed. He promised only to be a changed factor in a ledger he had once used to extract interest. Abbas felt the enormity of that promise like a tide in a small pool. It raised the water level and revealed stones that had been hidden. For the first time since Mariam had gone, Abbas felt the possibility of being part of a moral community again rather than merely an observer. The neighborhood's small life had ways of knitting itself slowly, and he, through the improbable agency of a cat, had become a stitch. The council Rahim had invoked, the informal meeting of elders and those who kept the town's fragile order, decided to call a hearing. It took place in the back room of the cafe that Musa would sometimes open on early mornings when the sun was honest. The battery seller came with a look that suggested he'd been sucking the marrow of nights for the courage to face daylight. Neighbors who once sat on the fringes of affairs drew their chairs into the circle. Nyla sat too, holding thread on her lap with a careful hand that belonged to nurses and women who had made livelihoods of small mercies. She wore no accusation. Rather, she arranged her feelings in order like a nurse setting a splint. When the council convened, the object of discussion was not simply what had happened to Thread, but what the theft said about the town. It had, they agreed, become too easy to treat small things as if they were public amusements. The stocky youth who had orchestrated the theft was summoned and made to stand in the middle of people whose daily work usually did not involve such ceremonial judgment. The hearing was not a spectacle arranged for punishment, but a communal attempt to make cruelty socially expensive. The youth who had been taught to view fear as currency was asked to perform a restitution. He would help mend the very things he had been part of breaking. He would repaint the shop door he had defaced, clean windows he had scuffed, and spend evenings helping Rahim and others protect market women's roots. The punishment was public, not because the town enjoyed shame, but because it needed to show that cruelty would yield consequence. The young man accepted the terms with the awkwardness of one who had rarely been asked to repair rather than destroy. When asked why he had joined the men who had taken Thread, he flinched and muttered the usual reasons, showing he belonged, convincing a small crowd of his strength, impressing friends. In the council's quiet, those motives seemed both mundane and terrible. The youth's apprenticeship into cruelty was a lesson the elders recognized. Boys become men by learning the town's grammar, and here the grammar had included sadism as a form of belonging. The council's restoration aimed to reteach belonging in gentler vernaculars: service, repair, watchfulness. Abbas watched the youth in the meeting and was surprised by a feeling that was not hate but pity. Pity because the man had been taught to measure himself against other men's applause. Thread, content now on Nayla's lap, closed his eyes as if the world were merely a place where small human dramas would unfold and then fold. The cat's presence in the room made judgments softer than they might have otherwise been. It was as if Thread's quiet, inscrutable attention forced people to measure their words, against the testament of a living creature whose only interest seemed to be belly rubs and safe passes across hot asphalt outside. The meeting there were other payoffs to be collected. Rahim, true to his promise, began to operate differently. He had men who would have once served as instruments of his will. He now told them to watch the corners where women walked alone. He paid for extra lamps along the alley that sat too long in shadow. He repaired in quiet the property of people the town often forgot. These acts were small and deliberate. They were the kind of civic kindness that had the slow power of rain. People noticed. Some told stories of changes as if they were seeds sown. The battery seller, who had always been a man of small philosophies, remarked to Abbas that it seemed harder for men to take advantage of darkness when darkness had fewer places to hide. There was also the gentle domestic payoff of the plants. Mariam's basil, which had survived grief by stubbornness, seemed to renew itself under Abbas's intentional care. He clipped it and used its leaves in soup and in tea, and in so doing found that tending a plant taught him how to attend to a life. The jasmine, which had bent toward his window as if listening, now coiled its tendrils into the morning wind, filling the air like an old hymn. Its scent accompanied Abbas as he worked, a small, intimate consolation that spoke of persistence rather than sudden miracles. Even the spider plant, which had once begged with drooping arms for neglect to stop, reached out new tendrils to the light and dropped a baby plant into a neighbor's pot as if to say, "Keep looking out." Plants had been the foreshadowing earlier in the story. Now they served as the quiet payoffs, proof that small, steady care returns in growth. Thread's healing progressed as gentleness did, in increments and with setbacks. He kept a small cough that would sometimes make Abbas pause, and once or twice a fever chased him into an anxious watch. But the cat's body learned to trust the rhythm of care. It grew fond of Abbas's lap, and would often choose to sleep stretched across a measuring tape on the tailor's bench, as if declaring that where there had been only tools, there could also be company. Thread's presence taught Abbas the grammar of responsibility, how to ration worry so it does not consume you, how to prioritize what you can mend. In return, Abbas offered the cat an oath that felt like something between prayer and promise. "I will not let you be thrown again." Nyla's place in the neighborhood, after the hearing, changed in subtle ways. People came to her when they needed a kind of consolation that public decrees could not deliver. Advice on a child's cough, bandages for a fall, the tradecraft of making a small life hold. She did not ask for recognition. She accepted shoes shined, bread left on her step, and small thanks like coins. She also taught Rahim small skills of repair that did not involve force, how to listen to a child's fear, how to make an apology without armor. There was, between Rahim and Nayla, a slow amending. Their old ledger would not be erased, but it could be balanced with new items, acts of protection and service, testimony in public for what had been missed. Abbas changed too. He discovered that courage is a habit as trainable as muscle. He no longer imagined that he must be stoic until something remarkable happened to pull him from quiet. He learned instead that the ordinary choices of each day mattered because being a man of mercy meant practicing mercy. He took steps small and available. He kept the shop open an hour later for a woman who worked in the laundry and had no time during the day. He mended clothes donated by neighbors who could not pay. He taught a boy in the neighborhood how to thread a needle without scaring him with lectures about manhood. These were tiny revolutions compared to the grand narratives of heroism, but their accumulative effect was a new atmosphere, a town learning to count kindness as capital. Community life resumed with new rules in the margins. The stocky youth performed his restitution in full view. He painted over the scrawled word on Abbas's door with a neat rectangle of white, a visible act that said the town would not indulge its meaner pleasures. He volunteered in Rahim's watch, standing at corners that once had belonged to stealthy danger. People watched to see whether the change would last. Doubt and hope braided themselves in the same conversations. Some neighbors remained skeptical, for old habits die hard, and the city holds the memory of what was once possible like a weapon. Yet even skeptics could not help but notice the difference in the way market women now walked with fewer looks over shoulders. The ledger had changed somewhat. Accounts had been adjusted. The spider plant rewarded Abbas's new attentions with a baby that he cut and passed to the grocery girl, who tied the small pot to her stall and smiled at its audacity. The basil, after many careful clippings and stews, grew bushy and arrogant, and Abbas began to share its leaves with others, breaking portions off as if distributing proof of growth. The jasmine pooled its scent into the evenings like a story told not too loudly. In these domestic acts, the story's symbolic plants gave proof that tending was tangible, and their returns were not in headline gestures, but in the ordinary economy of breath and smell. In the weeks that followed, the people of the town developed rituals for keeping the small protective order. At dusk, a group of men and a surprising number of women took turns walking the routes of the market, not as a show of force but as a promise. Their watchfulness was not meant to be visible grandstanding. It was calibrated to let ordinary life breathe. Rahim led without swagger. His steps were part penance and part care. He and Abbas sometimes walked together in silence, watching as Thread darted ahead and slipped under a bench before returning like an inspector, making sure a city's small instruments were still functioning. There were setbacks. Once, a crate of produce was ruined overnight by vandals who had not been swayed by community talk. Another time, the stocky youth's friends tested whether change was merely costume. One of them hurled a stone through a bakery window in the dead of night. These incidents did not demolish the new order, but they reminded the town that change requires maintenance. Community vigilance was not a single act but a laborious persistence. When such mischief occurred, people gathered to repair the damage and to remind one another, sometimes with harsh words, sometimes with boxes of bread, that cruelty would be met with collective consequence. In the quieter hours of this thawing, Abbas found his grief reframed. Grief did not leave. It lightened in ways that felt like the careful pulling of a thorn. Miriam's voice came in memory less as a demand and more as instruction. Tend the little things. He found comfort in the repetition of service, recognizing that being charitable was not a display but a repetition that strengthened the soul. He learned to laugh small and private laughs at Thread's absurdities, the way the cat would, without ceremony, steal a spool of thread and bat it across the floor like a prize. These were the domestic triumphs that warded off isolation. Even Rahim, whose life had been a ledger of fear and favors, discovered that public amends were a form of freedom. He slept with less of the old tightness in his chest because his nights no longer required the constant policing of every corner with suspicion. Nyla's presence continued to be an equal partner in these changes. She refused to let the town forget the lesson that kindness must be deliberate, and that promises made in one season must be cultivated in the next. She continued to nurse the small, wounded bird's sore feet, embarrassed apologies, building a catalog of low-cost mercies that mattered profoundly. There came a morning when Abbas set Thread on his work table with the precision of a man laying out pattern pieces. The cat flicked its tail and, in a gesture that might have once been read as vagary, knocked over a jar of buttons. They scattered like small coins. Abbas laughed, a sound that surprised even him because it was brighter than the usual low tones of his reserve. He collected the buttons and fed Thread a sliver of basil as a reward for its mischief. The jasmine leaned into the window's light as if applauding. At the time when the town considered whether to commemorate the incident, a week by busied hands, a month in the water of talk, or a year in the ledger, they chose a small, practical memorial. A lamp post at the corner of the market would be repaired and kept lit each night, and a simple bench would be placed where mothers could sit while their children played. They called it modestly the keeping place, a name neither pompous nor minimal. The bench was painted a friendly color, and Rahim himself handed the first coat of paint with a hand that had once known only rougher trades. The ceremony was short and without speeches because people who had been taught to hide their feelings chose this time to let small acts stand. Thread sat on a woman's lap at the ceremony, flicking its tail and watching the world with the lazy sovereignty of cats. Abbas sat nearby and felt the jasmine's perfume like an old blessing. Midway through these reconciliations, the story asked its soft question of the listening heart. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? The town answered in its own manner, not by doctrinal proclamations but by action. The grocery girl seeded small packets of basil with other neighbors. The battery seller gave nights to watch the lanes when storms threatened. The stocky youth, now given the name of a man learning to be less foolish, tutored a boy in keeping a watch and fixing a window. The answer was yes, and yes again in the way a chorus returns to a theme. The falling action, as it settles, is not the neat arrangement of all threads into a single braid. It is a slow, patient untying and restitching. Men like Rahim do not become saints overnight. They become neighbors again. Boys who had cheered cruelty find other ways to be noticed, by the skill of painting evenly, by the hesitancy that becomes patience, by learning the dignity of repair. Abbas learns that grief does not vanish, but that it sits in the same room as joy without suffocating it. Nayla's work continues, and Thread grows less edgy, more given to the small displays of domestic tyranny that make a house a home. The plants continue to witness and reward attendance. Their leaves proof that small attentions yield visible returns. In the end, the town settled into a new, fragile rhythm, one where cruelty would be costlier, where mercy had allies, and where a cat would be allowed to walk, unthreatened, over hot asphalt because people had decided, together, to change how they measured themselves. The ledger had been amended in small ways. A lamp fixed, a bench placed, a youth apprenticed to repair. The weight of consequence had shifted. Once a man's reputation had been enough to make wrongdoings possible. Now a man's reputation could be used to protect and to atone. The falling action set a place at the table for the ordinary acts that sustain communities. It whispered a truth in the tone of old fables, that courage can be humble, that repentance can be public work, and that the smallest life, fur and whiskers and a soft purr, can summon the largest sorts of change. Dawn found the street as if it had been asleep in a chair and woken with its shoes on the wrong feet. Awkward, contrite but already moving, morning pressed itself into the gutters and drew small lines of steam from the asphalt where night had lain heavy. Thread woke in Abbas's lap and blinked at the world with the unimpeachable indifference of cats and the secret gratitude of survivors. Rahim walked past the shop as if testing his own shadow for truth. Nyla's stoop held a basket of bandages like a small altar. The jasmine leaned its head to the window with the familiarity of old prayers. The town, which had been a ledger of habits, now contained a new item, one small as a purr and consequential as a law. People passed each other with the gentleness of those who have seen danger and chosen repair. Yet the past does not dissolve simply because one chooses to be better. It waits, it keeps accounts, and it asks for proof. In the narrow hours before market, as Abbas tied a new seam and thread purred like a tiny engine, the day demanded an answer. Will the new tender measures hold when wind arrives that wishes to unsettle them? The answer the town would give was not to be written in proclamations, but in the steady tally of small mornings. The days that followed the courtyard's reckoning were not gilded with triumphant music. They were quieter, and therefore more true. The town learned to speak its new language in acts rather than phrases. Lamps stayed lit because men and women agreed to the habit of looking, and that small habit became a protection that did not wear armor. Abbas found that his mornings were measured differently. Where once grief had dictated the rhythm, now the exigencies of care, Thread's food, the basil's trimming, the jasmine's pruning made his hands busy in a way that steadied his chest. It is a particular mercy, available to those who have been wounded and still have the humility to practice craft. The mending of things teaches the mending of selves. Thread, for his part, took to the new life with the inscrutable efficiency of animals who understand obligations more by pattern than by speech. He would sleep on the spool-strewn bench while Abbas stitched, and when the tailor paused to measure a hem, the cat would step forward, test the cloth with soft paws, and then decide whether it was proper. The cat's small rulings, this chair is suitable, this lap is warm, became part of Abbas's days. Thread's cough lessened as mornings became steadier. Abbas learned to dose kindness the way a good gardener waters, not all at once but often enough to encourage growth. Rahim's transformation was neither sudden nor unblemished. Public atonement is not an insurance against old habits. It is a project that requires daily labor. He kept the watch he had promised, but he kept it without the spectacle of showy guards. He and his men walked as neighbors rather than wardens. They learned to carry their influence like an umbrella, open only when necessary and discreetly. Rahim used his knowledge not to frighten but to reroute danger. He negotiated with rivals in a language that used fewer threats and more firm refusals. He paid for street lamps in narrow alleys and taught young men to mend broken fences rather than break them. The book he had shown Abbas remained on his shelf. It became an instrument of memory and a manual for restitution. Nayla resumed her quiet ministrations. Her role in the town expanded with the sobriety of one who understands that miracles are overvalued and small mercies underrated. People would come to her not only with scraped knees and coughs but with confessions of small cruelties they had done, boasts made to friends, jokes that had stung, and she would receive them without theatrics. Her presence taught a peculiar lesson. Someone who tends the small wounds of a community accrues a kind of moral authority that cannot be bought with fear. Her work with Rahim did not absolve him of errors. Rather, it turned those errors into tasks that required attention. They walked often through the market in a companionable silence, picking up the flotsam of life and returning it to order. The stocky youth, who had once traded his reputation for the easy spectacle of cruelty, found his apprenticeship to repair deeper than he expected. At first, his hands fumbled over brushes and plaster. Then, as weeks progressed, the solidity of making a thing whole entered him like the slow advent of rain. He repaired broken panes at the cafe, painted cornices, and helped Rahim set up lanterns along alleys. The town watched with a combination of skepticism and amusement, and slowly, grudgingly, with a kind of stern approval. Boys who had once seen cruelty as a ticket to belonging began to see that belonging could be accrued by contribution, that being noticed need not require harm. The youth's fingers, once eager for the slap of power, learned the patient pressure of a brush that restores. The plants, those patient witnesses, offered their payback in plain green proof. The basil became bold under Abbas's attentive pruning. Its scent traveled in the evenings, and neighbors would pinch a leaf from passing plates in a habit of shared flavor. The jasmine grew into a small fountain of scent, its flowers abundant in the months that followed the trial by courtyard. Its perfume threaded through windows and down alleys and made the air softer at night. People who paused beneath its scent felt, briefly and inexplicably, less inclined to make cruel jokes. The spider plant gave offspring to the grocery girl and the laundry woman. Small new pots exchanged like tokens, and each new sprout multiplied the town's stake in careful living. In these innocent returns, a fable's requirement was satisfied. Plants planted in grief can return a harvest of gentleness. The council that Rahim had summoned remained an instrument of the town's repair. It was not a court in the formal sense, but an assembly of people who let wrongs be named and restitution be shaped in public. The council learned to listen, to demand that those who had been guilty perform acts that were meaningful rather than humiliating. It became in time an ordinary part of town life. When someone committed a selfish or cruel act, the explanation alone couldn't suffice. The town expected visible repair. That requirement reshaped social norms. If harm was to be done, it must be acknowledged and made right, not hidden under the cloak of indifference. But the resolution of a story is not the erasure of harm. Shadows remained. There were nights when men who had not been swayed by new arrangements tested the town's resolve. A crate was overturned, a window broken by someone emboldened by old habits, and the town had to act again, not in one dramatic rush, but in a series of patient, organized responses. The youth in Rahim organized night watches, but they also organized community repairs the following day. Neighbors would gather with paint and brushes, and not merely for the work, but for the ritual of mending in public. Those rituals, repeated, trained the town toward otherness, to see cruelty as labor that required public restitution rather than as sport without consequence. Abbas found his grief softening in ways that were not simplistic. The ache for Miriam's presence remained, but it shifted shape. Once it had been a cavern in which every sound echoed and returned as denial. Now it was more like a room with a window through which he could look outward. He began sometimes to speak of Miriam aloud, not as a thing to be concealed, but as a teacher. He would tell small stories to the boy who learned how to thread a needle, how Miriam loved basil and soup, how she braided hair in a way that made small girls feel like queens. These stories did more than remember. They transmitted habit. Abbas's grief now bore fruit. He shared kindness that bore her habits forward. Thread, whose life had begun in a careless toss onto hot asphalt, gave his final gift not as a miracle, but as a subtle, ordinary blessing. One morning when the market was humming and Abbas repaired a seam for a woman who had been saving for months, Thread slipped from the tailor's bench and, with the feline decorum of those who keep domestic law, jumped onto the shoulder of the stocky youth. The crowd paused. A woman dropped a bundle and a child looked up, and the youth, surprised, froze as the cat threaded itself around him like a small fastener. Thread's head rubbed against the youth's cheek in a gesture that owed nothing to strategy and everything to an animal's economy of touch. The youth's face, which had been practiced in postures of defiance, broke into something like astonishment and then softened. It was a private-public thing, a cat's small approval given where cruelty had been practiced. The gift was not dramatic because it did not solve all problems, but it solved a certain human crisis. The youth had been seeking proof that he could be accepted without mean acts. Thread's action gave him a token that could not be argued away. From that day, the youth's hands learned the craft of care with an inward rectitude. He still stumbled. He still had to be reminded. But the town, watching small change, accepted the sign and gave him opportunities for restitution that were not humiliating. Thread's act was a small, perfect delivery, an invitation to become what one had not been taught to be. There were other, quieter reconciliations. Raheem returned on occasion to the small park where he had once seen his own life twist into the collars of debt. He would sit on the bench now painted and called the keeping place and watch the market. People would nod to him with something like respect that did not require fear. He returned the nod with humility. Nyla would bring him a small cup of tea, and across the bench they would discuss logistics of watch and minor repairs. They worked to set up a fund for emergencies, small coin put in by shopkeepers for the vet or for repairing a door quickly before mischief could be made of it. That fund's existence was more important than any single payout. It became a ritual that taught the town to anticipate care rather than wait until catastrophe. The most notable change occurred in how the town thought of animals. Thread's trial and recovery had taught them that cruelty to creatures was seldom a benign act. It is either a symptom of something worse or the direct training of sadism for amusement. The town's children were taught new lore. We do not harm what cannot consent. It is a small moral axiom, but such axioms, taught early, become the scaffolding on which civility is built. The market's boys, once prone to throw stones for fun, were now taught to fetch water for the stalls or to listen while elders told stories about repair. The city's future, shifting by small increments, bore traces of a community that had learned to tie kindness into its fabric. Abbas's shop did better than anyone expected. Perhaps the market liked the novelty of tailoring with jasmine-scented windows. Perhaps the town wanted to reward a man who had chosen a difficult, steady kindness. Customers came not only for threads and hems but for quiet counsel. His hands translated sorrow into practical fixes. A tear in a coat became a place to teach a neighbor how to stitch. People began to bring in clothes that had been neglected, and the tailor's bench became a place where stories were exchanged along with stitches. Thread sat on the bench like a small, imperious partner, accepting visitors with an aristocratic air that made children laugh. The final gifts, the small things that make a life memorable, followed in the ordinary course of days. The jasmine produced a season more lavish than any in recent memory. Neighbors clipped its vines and braided them into bowls of scent at festivals. The basil spread, people swapped cuttings like blessings, and the spider plant sprouted babies that went into windows all over the block. The town's summer festival that year included a performance where a boy, once known for reckless bravado, read a short piece about repair and restitution. His voice faltered but held, and the applause was not for drama, but for the courage of being ordinary and good. Abbas would sometimes sit at night and remember how Thread had arrived, hurled, like a question onto hot asphalt, and how a man, whose collar had once told the whole town to be, still had stepped forward and changed the form of his influence. He thought of Miriam and how she might have smiled at the smallness of it all. How the world's great dramas often resolve in tiny acts, tea brewed, basil clipped, a window painted. He understood, as Kipling's moral fables insist, that the universe answers in its own time and terms. What matters is not spectacle, but the stubborn inventory of small virtues kept each day. And so the resolution settled not as an ending, but as a stable pattern. The town's ledger remained thick, but some lines had been altered. Cruelty no longer carried no cost. Mercy had allies and practical implements. Young men learned to earn respect through mending rather than by terrifying. Thread lived long enough to be the small blessing he had earned. He grew fat on patient love and good soup, and would sometimes disappear for hours only to reappear at the exact moment a child needed comfort. In those unannounced returns, people began to say, half jokingly and half devoutly, that the cat kept accounts of its own. If there is a universal truth here, it is one told in the voice of fable. Small kindnesses are the architecture of community. The great sweeping acts of heroism are rarer than the steady, repeated choices that shape a neighborhood over seasons. A man who walks his old routes but now makes of them paths of tender watchfulness changes a street more profoundly than one loud act of righteousness. A woman who nurses the small hurts of a community builds moral capital that repays itself manifold. And a small creature, when spared from cruelty and given into the care of those who learn by tending, returns society to itself in ways unmeasured by ledgers. In the end, the last gift came as a quiet, ceremonious act. Several months after Thread's rescue, the council organized a modest dedication of the bench in the market's keeping place. People who had once stood apart now sat together. Rahim and Nayla stood. Abbas sat with Thread in his lap. The stocky youth carried a pot of basil. He had grown himself. Each person offered a small testimony, some awkward, some precise, about what they had learned. The youth spoke last and said without brag, "I used to think strength was the making of others small. Now I know strength can be the making of others whole." It was not a grand speech. It was the confession of a man made available for goodness. Thread, as if understanding the ceremony, stood on the bench and walked in a slow circle until he reached the youth and then rubbed his head against the boy's knee. The gesture drew a sound from the crowd like a breath of relief, and somewhere a woman clapped because she could not contain gratitude into silence any longer. The sunlight slanting through jasmine gilded the edges of things in an ordinary way. The town's ledger remained complex, but in the margins of that day a new line was written. Small mercies collected become a village. Thus the story leaves its people not unscarred, but more whole, their edges guided toward a future that has been offered an option, repair instead of cruelty. The moral, if a fable must have one, is plain. Mercy, once practiced in public, becomes enforceable by habit. Cruelty, once costly, becomes inconvenient. The smallest lives, furred, fragile, and blinking, can teach large lessons if we allow ourselves the humility to learn. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.